Welcome. I'm Randy Turner with the Governor's Committee on People with Disabilities. I am the Accessibility and Disability Rights Coordinator. We are here today with Dr. Christy Orr from the University of A&M, or A&M University, and Alicia Guevara from Lone Star College to talk about accommodations in college, successfully navigating the transition. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Orr.
Thanks, Randy. And if you could share our presentation, that would be great. Alicia and I are really excited to present today for you. As Randy said, I'm from Texas A&M, and Alicia is from Lone Star College from the system. So we are hopefully going to give you kind of the large university perspective and the community college perspective. But we also are very familiar with other schools, both in Texas and across the nation. So it's not really just about Texas A&M or Lone Star, but just information that will help you in general to understand a little bit more about the transition to higher ed for students who have disabilities and are going to be going to any kind of college or university setting afterwards. So we do have a few objectives for you. One is that, as I mentioned, we want to discuss the transition from high school to college, some of the differences between high school and college that you can expect, and then just what that transition looks like in general, as well as for someone who has a disability and will be seeking some services there. We're going to talk a little bit about the different kind of accommodations that you might see on the college level versus in high school. And then how to access accommodations. We know sometimes there's so much information that's being provided. It can be a little confusing to figure out how you get what you need, what office to go to, and what you'll be able to get there. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about students' rights and responsibilities related to their accommodations in college, because it is a little bit different and it's important for you to understand what your responsibilities are, and then also the fact that you do have rights that you need to be able to be aware of when you go to the college setting. We do know that you may have questions that come up as we go through this presentation. We are going to ask that you hold those questions until the end. You can put them in the Q&A box at any point, but we're going to answer them at the end. And I think we've left plenty of time for those questions. We do just ask that you keep them somewhat general versus about a specific student situation, since that can vary quite a bit from student to student, as well as from campus to campus. So I'm going to have Alicia talk a little bit about that transition.
Thanks, Christy. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit just about transition in general, and then we'll talk specifically about transitioning for some items specific to students with disabilities. So knowing that the transition from high school to college is a big transition for any student, any family, you know, it's not a simple process, I don't think, for anyone to experience. So just know going into this process that everyone has to make that transition, and it can be very emotional. It can have a lot of challenges as you go through the process. So just be aware of that you're not alone, that what you're experiencing is probably common to everyone else that's going through this same situation as well. So just know you're not alone and reach out if you need some support or assistance as you go through the process. So first, let's talk about some of these challenges that are familiar for everyone going through the process, right? Admissions, questions, or challenges. So depending on what school, college, university the student is attending, they may encounter questions about the application process, the admissions process. They may need to call and get those questions answered. Having the student do those things themselves, that may be the first time they've had to call and you know, talk to a helpline kind of process. Paying for college can be a challenge for a lot of families and a lot of students. You know, filling out the FAFSA form and other financial aid documents, scholarship applications, it can be challenging. There's questions that maybe students haven't ever had to answer before. Learning time management is a big challenge for a lot of students. You're having to cook or prepare your own meals or go to a dining hall and get them. You're having to clean your own space, do your own laundry. all of those life things that maybe your family or parents helped you with before, that now it's kind of up to you to figure out how you're going to fit in your studying, your schoolwork, on top of all of those other things as well. Study skills is another one. It's really common for students to come in and say, you know, I never really had a study before. I never had a study in high school. I don't really know what that means. How do you study? So learning what that means, and it's different for different people. It's different for different majors, different types of classes, different types of tests. You approach all of those different settings a little bit differently. So learning all of those different skill sets. Adapting to more challenging class content. So not only can the content of the class be more difficult than they're used to, maybe the class is presented in a style or a format that a student has never experienced before. So that might be a challenge for a student. Students have to select a major when they get to college. A lot of students, when they get to college, really don't know what they want to major in. So they have to go through that process of selecting a major or figuring out what they're good at, what they want to do with the rest of their life, kind of, you know, it's a big decision. Learning how to access the resources on campus, whether that's tutoring, counseling, meeting with professors, knowing what office hours are with their professor, and that actually is the time to go meet with them. All of those kinds of things can be challenging for students if they've never experienced any of those things before, and they're on a new campus in a new setting that they've never experienced before. So all of these things are very common challenges that students are going to face regardless of whether they have a disability or not. So next we're going to talk about some things that are specific more to students with disabilities. So students with disabilities will have some additional barriers that students without disabilities are probably not going to face. So figuring out the accommodation process, that can be a big one. Students may not always want to set up accommodations proactively. Some students want to go to college and try it on their own, you know, before they set up the accommodations, and that's fine, that's their right. But they then, at that point, whenever they decide to do the accommodation process, still have to figure it out, whether that's halfway through the semester or before classes begin. It's still a process. They have to understand new or different accommodations sometimes. So a student may not have the same accommodations that they had in high school. So figuring out what those accommodations are and how they work can be something that a student has to, you know, work through. Some students have software or new software as a part of their college accommodations. So you're having to learn how to use that software, all the functionality of it, how it works on your computer or things like that. A lot of students have testing accommodations, things like extended time on tests and that kind of thing. So a testing center is often part of their accommodation process, and they have to learn how to use that testing center on campus, know where it is, know how to schedule tests, etc. So that can be something that a student has to kind of work their way through that first semester. And then a lot of times students might still encounter something that's inaccessible. So whether that's maybe some kind of course materials that their professor posts online, whether that's a physical barrier for a student that, you know, is using a wheelchair or a walker, whether that's, you know, some kind of experience on campus in the residence halls or something that a student is going through and experiencing, and they're just finding that it's not an accessible situation for them. Students have to learn who to contact about those things. And sometimes that's not always centralized on every college campus. So you may not contact the same person for every one of those situations. So that can be a learning process. And often your disability services providers can help you get to the right person in any of those situations, but it can be a learning process. So I will turn it back over to Christy to talk a little bit about the differences in high school and college.
Yeah, so not only is the transition just a little bit different in general, as Alicia said, for any student, for disabled student, but also the laws that cover the kinds of accommodations that students get and that access issue for students are different. So in high school, students either fall under IDEA, so the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Some students are under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So people talk about having a 504 plan. But in general, in high school, the purpose is to make sure that students with disabilities have the availability of a free and appropriate public education that's designed to meet their unique needs. So the wording is a little different than when you get to college. In college, where the rights of students are governed by the Americans with Disabilities Act and the amendments, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So 504 is appropriate for both, but it's applied a little bit differently in college. And the purpose of those is to provide equitable access to disabled students or students with disabilities, depends on your framework there, otherwise qualified for the program or activity. So it's really about access. And we talk a lot in colleges and universities about access. And the fact that when you get to that level, we are looking at removing barriers for students to make sure that their educational experience doesn't have barriers because of the fact that they have a disability. And I'm going to put in the chat a link to a letter from the Office of Civil Rights that is a letter to parents. That's just a little bit more explaining that. It's a little bit old, so it's from 2007, but I think it's just kind of a helpful summary. It's short and just looking at the fact that it is different when students go to college. So what that means is that in college, all students have to meet the same learning outcomes or objectives, either with or without an accommodation. So there's not a different degree in general if you're going through a regular college program for someone who has what would be called in high school a 504 plan. So if a student has accommodations through a disability services or disability resource office, they're going to get the same degree as everyone else, and they have to meet those same learning objectives and outcomes. How they do that can be a little bit different if they're using accommodations, but they are going to go through that same kind of degree program. And what that means also is that in college, accommodations cannot fundamentally alter the class, program, or activity or its requirements. So it really is looking at having that same educational experience, those same outcomes, even though because of accommodations, it might look slightly different, it's going to end up with those same learning objectives. They're going to have the same degree as everyone else. But it also does mean that the accommodations might look a little bit different depending on what accommodations a student was provided in high school. And I'm going to skip to the last bullet because that kind of fits with that. But some examples of that would be things like different exam formats or less answer choices. So because you have those same learning objectives, there isn't usually the opportunity to have maybe 2 answer choices instead of 4 on a multiple choice test. Typically, we don't change the format of a test to be, so if someone is used to having multiple choice tests, usually we're not able to change that format into essay exams. There are some exceptions. So in the world of disability, a lot of times we say the answer is always, it depends. So we are not going to say that never happens, but in general, the format of a test isn't going to change. The way that the instruction is taught probably isn't going to change, but it's just that we're going to talk a little bit later about accommodations and what those look like. And sometimes we make the distinction between accommodations and modifications. So some students in high school may have had modifications where it's actually changed. Accommodations are just adding on another way to have access. Also keep in mind that in college, there are some settings that are not typically happening in a high school. So there may be needs that a student has in relation to residence halls, or maybe dining facilities, or parking. So there are other things beyond just the classroom that we may be looking at in the college setting when we're looking at accommodations. I think Alicia's going to talk a little bit about where you go.
So I think probably the first step for most people is figuring out where you need to go to set up your accommodations, right? Or where do you start that process? So For most colleges, if you go to their home page, so whatever the college's home website is, if you type in the word disability into the search feature there, it normally will pull up the right office or department that provides disability services, disability resources. The name of that office can vary by college and varies pretty widely. Some sample names are Disability Resource Center, Accessibility Services, Services for Students with Disabilities, Office for Disability Access. So the name is kind of varies by whatever that college prefers, but it normally has words like disability, access, accessibility in the title. So that's kind of a clue that you found the right place, at least to begin. If you really, you search and you really can't find anything that seems right, your academic advisors, your admissions offices, places like that should be able to direct you to the right place or give you the right contact information for you to get connected. So just know if your internet search really doesn't produce what you think that you should be getting, definitely reach out to one of those other offices to get the right contact information. The next question we often get is, when can I apply for my accommodations, or when can I request my accommodations? So it's usually best to do it no later than the summer before you start. It takes time to set up some accommodations. The amount of time it takes to set up accommodations can vary depending on what those accommodation requests are. So you definitely don't want to wait past that summer before classes start if it's something that might take some time to set up. If you need things like housing accommodations, you probably want to start this process substantially earlier than that. Most colleges already have their housing set up prior to the summer starting. So if you haven't set up housing accommodations by that point, you're probably limiting what your options are going to be in that realm. So just keep that in mind. Parking is another one that often is limited if you wait until the summer to set that up on most college campuses. But most schools, you can start sending in your accommodation request as soon as you decide that you're going to attend there by accepting your offer of admission. So as soon as you accept that offer of admission and say, yes, I'm going there, you can start that process of requesting your accommodations through the Disability Services or Disability Resources Office. Every college might kind of vary on when they recommend starting that. So I would suggest that you definitely reach out to that specific college's office and ask them about their process for that. Here at Lone Star College, we're a community college and we have a testing center that is not just for students with disabilities, it's for all kinds of students. And a lot of students that are not Lone Star College students will use our testing center to complete their pre-college testing requirements. So whether that's an AccuPlacer for acceptance into a college, whether that's a student who took maybe advanced political science classes in high school and they want to take a CLEP test so that they don't have to take intro political science classes in college. Any of those kinds of things can be taken here on our campus in our testing center. But if a student needs accommodations, they have to set those up through our office. So often students are connecting with our office even before they might be a student here at Lone Star College, or even if they're never planning to become a student at Lone Star College. So, you might be connecting with the Disability Services Office earlier based on your specific needs or your specific situation. So just keep that in mind, but definitely contact the office of the college to find out what that process looks like. And then the next step is really, how do I make this request? How do I make my request to the office? So on our next slide, we'll talk about how to access accommodations in college. The first thing is that you definitely should contact that Disability Resources or Disability Services office because it can vary again by campus. But typically speaking, there's some kind of form or online form that you'll fill out. Often it's a questionnaire kind of situation and you answer the questions. We definitely recommend that students fill out this questionnaire, not parents. I know that's hard to kind of give that over to the students, but it helps us get the student's perspective, the student's language, and kind of their experience. And then once they filled that out, you'll attach documentation typically to that online request or the physical form if there's a physical form being filled out. A lot of parents and students have questions about what should my documentation be? What does appropriate documentation look like for me? And it's hard to give specifics for an individual in such a large group setting like this, but each college can set their own policies and requirements for documentation, but a kind of a general broad perspective is that it typically needs to be current. It typically needs to be provided and or signed by a qualified evaluator or provider. So depending on what type of disability is, someone that's qualified to diagnose and or treat whatever that type of disability is. And then it needs to describe the disability and the impacts of that disability so that the disability services providers can understand what the barriers are to access in the educational setting or in life in general, depending on what type of accommodations are being requested. But the goal with the documentation is that the Disability Services Office can work with the student to really discuss what that college experience is going to be like and figure out what the right accommodations are from the get-go so that students don't have a negative experience or have to encounter that barrier to actually set up the accommodations like after a bad situation has happened to the student. So the goal is that if we talk through all of those things that could potentially happen, you'll have a positive experience from the start. Everything will go smoothly. So that's really our goal, and that's the kind of the point of having that self-report from the student on their form and then the documentation from the qualified provider.
And I'll add to that. One place when Alicia talked about finding the website for the disability office, most of those websites will have some more information about the kind of documentation that they're looking for. A lot of times I know I was thinking, what kind of questions might we get? So I know we get asked a lot, what is current? And that really varies. It varies by college or university, what they consider to be current. It also varies by disability because some disabilities, very long-standing, nothing's really going to change. And it may be that maybe even something from elementary school might be considered current, depending on what the disability is. Something like mental health might need to be a little bit more current because that's something that, although it may not go away, it may have changed over time. And we might want something that tells us, how's the student doing right now so that we can figure out the best accommodations. Definitely being signed by a qualified evaluator, I think goes across the board that that's something that everyone is going to want to see. We also get asked, I think sometimes the perception can be that we are trying to make a student prove that they have a disability or that we're making it difficult. And the offices, the disability offices, are really trying to figure out the best way to accommodate the student. And as we talked about before, there's a lot of different environments across campus. The way that instruction is given is often different than in high school. And so we really want that information both from the student and from the evaluator so that we can figure out for that specific student what kind of accommodations are going to remove those barriers so that they can have access. So it really is, it's not trying to be a challenging process, but it's really trying to be a process where we can make the best choices to set the student up for success and remove those barriers. So I think it's important to kind of understand that perspective is that definitely disability offices want students to have access and don't want this documentation to be a barrier. And then another piece to that is that students can always contact the office if they're having trouble with documentation and get some help. So asking, this is what I've got. They may be told, submit what you have and let's see if that's enough. Sometimes there are offices that say, well, we'll go ahead and provide accommodations for a semester or a year or something while we work with you to try to get some more updated information. Another piece to that you always think of things while you're talking these through, but when you look at standardized testing, so we see that a lot here on our campus, is students after college are going to apply to graduate school or medical school or law school or some other, they need to take a test to be certified in something. When it comes to those, they have their own documentation requirements, and they're typically much more strict. So we do want students to understand that just because they were provided accommodations in high school or college doesn't mean that it will happen the next step along the way. And we try to make sure that students understand that, so that if they maybe are going to need some updated testing or something like that to get accommodations and standardized testing later, that we give that information to them. So with that, talking a little bit about the students' responsibilities. So once you get past high school, the student actually has a lot more responsibility. And it's important to note that that is the student's responsibility. So when you get to college, the parent really kind of moves to the back burner. It doesn't mean that parents can't be of assistance to the student. We actually try to think of parents as partners to some extent. So we recognize that parents know the student way better than we do. Reading a piece of paper that the student told us about their disability or reading a testing report is not the same as living with someone for 17 or 18 or 20 years. But at the same time, the student has become an adult once they move into college. Their rights to privacy and their information becomes their own information. So even if they're not 18 yet, when they become a college student, their privacy rights become their own. So it's important to note that, because parents can help. We highly encourage parents to, if you want to help by looking at the website and figuring out what the process is and helping your student through the process if they need that, that's totally acceptable. But when it comes to actually making a request for accommodations, or as Alicia said, filling out that form, we really want that to be the student's responsibility, because the student is going to have to be the one interacting with the faculty. They're going to be the ones who are getting accommodations, using those accommodations, determining if those accommodations are working for them. So it's important to let the student be the main driver of those kinds of conversations. As Alicia said, students do need to identify as early as possible. So when you get to the college level, the college is not responsible for seeking out who has a disability. So the university doesn't have to look at who's not doing well in their classes and try to do an assessment to figure out if they have a disability or not. The student actually has to come forward and let the university know that they have a disability and that they need accommodations. And then they work with the Disability Services Office to talk about what those accommodations would be. And we talk about that as an interactive process. So the student needs to tell us about what their needs are. And if they know what accommodations they need, that's helpful. But also the Disability Services Office will contribute based on the information from the documentation, maybe based on what they know other students have used. Then they may actually have additional accommodations that are suggested to the student that might be helpful. And we see that a lot with assistive technology. There's a lot of students who may not have used assistive technology, which Alicia will talk about a little bit later in the past, but that may be something that helps them when they get to the college level to be able to become more independent in using accommodations. And when they get to the working field, that'll help them with that. So after self-identifying, the students do have to complete that process. So whatever it looks like on their college to set up the accommodations. They have to submit the paperwork, meet with the staff. They do have to communicate with professors. So typically they have a letter that they will provide to the faculty members. It may come directly from the disability office, or it may come from the student to the faculty member. And then if they have testing accommodations, they're responsible for scheduling the testing accommodations. One thing to note, sometimes there's a little bit of confusion if families submit, students submit documentation, either like as part of their admissions process, or they think that the high school is going to automatically send documentation to the college or university. That doesn't happen. So because students have a right to privacy, if you share information with one office on campus, that information doesn't get shared with another office just automatically. So it is important if you have paperwork from high school that you want to submit to the college or university, it's good to ask for that early. If you don't have copies of your own, I would request those from the high school, even maybe before you've decided which school you're going to. Go ahead and request a copy of that paperwork so that you've got it before everyone lets out for the summer. So in the spring semester, go ahead and ask for copies of the paperwork, have it on hand, and then be ready to provide that to the college that you're going to attend. Students are responsible for letting disability resources know if there's issues with their accommodations during the semester. So I'm going to go ahead, I saw that a question in the Q&A that I'm going to go ahead and answer here. Still on that slide, but going to answer the question about the accommodations and what happens if you don't get the accommodations that you need. So it's a little bit of a challenging question to answer because it depends on what the specific situation is. But if a student goes through the disability office, has an approved accommodation, and a professor is not providing that accommodation, it depends a little bit on the circumstances. So maybe in one situation, the student is supposed to get extra time on an online exam, and it didn't happen. So the first thing that would probably be the best thing to do in that situation would be to contact the professor directly, because most likely the professor forgot or something like that happened and they can fix it. If the student isn't comfortable with talking to the professor, or maybe there's a different situation where the professor said, I'm not going to provide that accommodation, then the student should go back to their disability services advisor, their contact person there, and let them know that the professor is not providing the accommodation so that they can then work with them and get that taken care of. If the situation is that for some reason the disability services office is not providing something that they were going to provide, then there should be some sort of grievance process or a way to address that should be on their website. You could also, every disability office falls kind of under a different chain of command. So you could go to the director of that office if you had a concern, or you could go above that person if you needed to find out what was happening. There could be other things that are happening as far as accommodations go. So if it's a parking accommodation question, it may be that going to the parking department and getting that resolved there might be helpful. But you can always go back to that disability office if it's related to an accommodation. So if that doesn't answer your question, feel free to put more in the Q&A. Again, probably not specific situation, but if it's something different than what I've addressed there. Alicia, I don't know, do you have any different answer than that before I move on?
No, I mean, I was thinking the same thing that you said. Like, typically, if the student doesn't let us know there's a problem, when it happens, we can't go, like, if you wait until the end of the semester to say, oh, my professor never gave me my extended testing time, or, oh, my professor never gave me copies of the PowerPoints, well, we can't go back and fix a whole semester. Like, we needed to know when it started happening. So I think that's the biggest thing for me. Like, a student can't wait till the end of the semester to say, oh, I was never given my accommodations, and then think the college is going to drop the class or remove it from their record or do something like that. Like, you have to let us know when it happens, or we can't resolve the problem. And the college isn't responsible for magically knowing that something wasn't happening in your class. You have to have let somebody know that that was going on so that we could resolve the issue.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm just going to say it again because it happens all the time, and it's really hard for us in the profession if a student doesn't let us know there's a problem. And sometimes that you just don't really realize that when you're in high school, you know, you're walking through the halls, you may be seeing teachers. It's a little bit easier just to say, hey, there's a problem, or for someone to notice, you know, depending on how things are set up. Your teachers may be talking about students if there's an issue. When you come to college, so Texas A&M, you probably know, is one of the largest universities in the country. We have multiple buildings and hundreds of acres. We don't know if a student is struggling unless they let us know. So if there is an issue with an accommodation, or I would even add, if a student is just not doing well and they think maybe they need another kind of accommodation or they need another resource, going back to that disability resources office and saying, I'm struggling. Even if the student doesn't know what they need, you can still ask and say, here's what's happening. Is there something else? Maybe there's another accommodation, or we are very good at knowing all the resources that are available on campus. So if you're struggling in a class, it may not be that you need a different accommodation, but it may be that you need to have some tutoring. And that tutoring may come from the Disability Services office, or it may be that we refer you to another office on campus that does that, or providing some academic support in another way. Or maybe, we think we talked to you and there's something happening with some depression or anxiety, and we can refer you to the counseling office on campus. So definitely, if you're struggling, a good place to go back to is to go back to the disability office and say, I need some help. Can you help me figure it out? Because we potentially can, but only if you let us know that there's an issue. On most campuses, students do need to renew their request each semester that they need accommodations. So usually just kind of a touching base, easy process. Sometimes you may need to meet with the office again. Some campuses, you don't have to do that process, but most of them you do need to ask each semester. And again, that process can look a little bit different depending on the campus. So those are kind of the students' responsibilities, but the students do have rights too. So it's important to recognize that. One thing that we make sure that students know is that students can request accommodations at any point. So if they are, they go through their first round of tests, I think Alicia kind of mentioned this. So say you take your first round of tests, we have a lot of students who say, I just didn't want to use accommodations. I wanted to try it without. I will point out that it's not the best logic usually because of all those transition things that we pointed out earlier. You can definitely get connected with the disability office and not use accommodations if you end up not needing them, but it's good to get set up just in case. But say you go through the first round of tests and you figure out that you need accommodations. You're not able to finish your tests on time, or you're getting very distracted because you're in big classes, or there may be some other accommodation that you need. Then you can still submit documentation to the office and you can get accommodations, but they start at that point. So if you make the decision not to request accommodations at the beginning of the semester, your accommodations won't start until you get set up with the disability office. So they won't go back and change your grade or remove a grade from earlier in the semester. The one kind of caveat to that is when you get to the very end of the semester, so say there's only a week left of school or something like that, depending on what kind of accommodations you need, they may not be able to be set up for that semester. So say you need note-taking accommodations, but there's only 1 week left of the semester, there may not be enough time to get a note taker set up that's going to be of any help to you before the final exams. But again, you don't have to do everything. Sometimes you hear you have to do everything by the 3rd week of the semester or something like that. That is not the case. You can submit information at any point. You also can expect that your disability information will remain confidential. So the fact that you are working with the disability office does not go on your transcript. Your faculty members will not know that you have accommodations or that you're connected with the office unless you tell them. So if you need accommodations, and maybe you need it for one class, but not another, then the class that you ask for accommodations in, that faculty member will know that, but not for another class that you have not requested for accommodations in. And as I mentioned earlier, because of FERPA, which is a privacy law, students' information is confidential, even from their parents, because the students now are the adult. Again, even if they're 17 or 16, when they become a student, those privacy rights are for them. And then the students also have the right to their accommodations being provided. So if they are approved by the Disability Center, they must be provided unless there is a fundamental alteration of the course because of the accommodations. So if there is something fundamental to the course that we are saying has to be altered, then that can be, there will have to be a lot of discussion. There's a whole process that you go through for that. But that is when an accommodation can be denied. That does not mean that a faculty member can get a letter from a student and say, oh, I'm not going to provide this accommodation to you, student, because it's a fundamental alteration. That needs to go back to the disability office, and there will be a whole process involved there. But we do kind of like to make that caveat, because the vast majority of accommodations, if they are on the letter, they have to be provided to the student.
So I think we mentioned this earlier that, sometimes students know exactly what they need. Sometimes students aren't sure exactly what to ask for when they come to the college setting, because maybe there are situations they haven't really thought through or thought about. So some of the most common accommodations that we see in the college setting, definitely number one is extended testing time. Almost every type of disability can impact that testing experience, the amount of time it takes you to get through the test, whether that's because it impacts your ability to process the information, to physically write information, to process it and get it back down on the paper, whether it's a variety of reasons, physically seeing the information, whatever the case may be. There's just so many reasons that it can take a little bit longer to get tests finished. So extended testing time is definitely the most common accommodation that we see. Closely related to that is either a reduced distraction environment, or some colleges call it a quiet testing environment for tests. So having a place not in your classroom setting typically, but a separated area like a testing center or a small group setting to take your tests in, to reduce the distractions that are involved, the coming and going of people as they complete their tests. Maybe noises in a classroom setting that are maybe not involved in a smaller testing center environment. That's very common as well. Breaks, so that students that might need to get up and leave the classroom for some reason, whether that's restroom needs, whether that's anxiety or panic attack type needs. There's a variety of needs that could cause the need to get up and leave the classroom occasionally. Recording lectures is a big one as well, and this looks different for different people with different types of needs or different types of technology. So if you think about how different types of disabilities might impact the note-taking experience, whether that's your ability to physically take the notes, whether that's the speed with which you can take down the notes, whether it's your ability to see what's on the board and accurately capture that information. Recording lectures can really support a lot of different types of note-taking. So whether you're using a digital recorder, whether you're using a smart pen, whether you're using a variety of different types of apps that are available for your computer, for your phone, things that will sync the recording with what you're typing or what you're writing. All of those things can really support that note-taking process so that it's a less stressful experience for you as the note taker. So instead of, I gotta capture every moment, every note, you can really kind of calm yourself down and really focus more on, I'm taking my notes, but I know that I'm also getting this recording as backup that's really supporting my note-taking process. So that can be a really great one, again, for a variety of needs. Also similar to that, or kind of working in conjunction with that, is often copies of PowerPoints or other displayed materials. Again, so that instead of the student just sitting there totally focused on copying down the information that's being displayed, they can actually focus on that additional information that the professor is explaining or is saying about the information that's displayed. Because if you're so focused on just copying down words, you're not actually hearing all of that information sometimes that the professor is talking about, or you're not having time to capture it in some way that you can go back and use later on to study with. So this next one's a little bit complicated for just a one-line kind of PowerPoint, but a lot of students have alternative formats. So that is often referred to as audiobooks, but it can look different for different students. Most of the time it's some type of electronic format, for sometimes just textbooks depending on the student's needs. Sometimes it's textbooks and their class materials, so handouts in class, articles that maybe the teacher wants the students to access for an assignment, whatever the case may be. Most of the time it's electronic in nature, but sometimes it could potentially be something like Braille. We really encourage students to learn an electronic format. Most students aren't going to want a Braille textbook, because a Braille textbook, if you've never seen it, is about 30 volumes that are like this thick and would fill up my entire desk. It's really hard to carry that around with you. It's not very functional in the real world. So if a student comes in being a solid Braille user, there are times where Braille is effective. But in terms of a textbook, carrying around a Braille textbook or using a Braille textbook, it's just not the most functional thing in the world. So we really encourage students to learn how to use electronic formats and the software that goes with those before they get to college, because that can be a really rough transition. If you've never used the software that you're going to need to access all of your course materials before you get to college, that's going to be a difficult semester. So some of the most common softwares that we see, so students that are blind or visually impaired would typically be using JAWS or some version of ZoomText if they have, a reasonable amount of functional vision still. If you have things like learning disabilities, reading disabilities, Kurzweil and Read and Write are probably the most common ones that we see there. There are other options, so I'm not saying that's it, but I'm saying those are probably the most common ones that we see. And some of them are very simple and easy to use and quick and easy to learn. Others of them are more complicated, more complex, have much more functionality sometimes. So sometimes it's worth learning that more complicated version of the software. But if you aren't functional in the software that you need, that is definitely a learning curve that a student is going to have to kind of pick up and learn how to handle. And there is training available for that in most disability services offices. There is normally an assistive technology provider, office, department, lab, something that will work with a student to teach them how to use the software, that will provide their textbooks and their materials in an accessible format for them. But that isn't going to just magically make that knowledge of that software happen. So there is some kind of a practice area there. So that's another reason that it might be really valuable to connect with your disability services office early, so that if you find out, oh, I am going to need to learn the software, you have plenty of time to practice it and use it over the summer, get used to it, do that on your own time, so you're not having to do that right in the middle of your fall semester. Some other common accommodations that we see are sign language interpreters and real-time transcription services for our deaf and hard of hearing student population. For students, particularly for students that have medical health-related disabilities, sometimes disability-related absences, which is sometimes called flexible attendance or modified attendance, can be really helpful if they're having a disability flare on a particular day or something like that. That can be helpful. As we mentioned, there are other situations and settings in college that maybe you don't think about, such as housing-related accommodations, needs in that realm, parking, those kinds of things. So definitely we see that quite a bit, dining. So don't forget to think about those kinds of things as you enter that college setting, and don't forget to request those things if you are going to need something in that outside of the classroom setting, essentially. And then if you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A, and we'll try to address as many of those as we can. We both have our email addresses here as well, so if we don't get to something today, you're welcome to reach out to us, and we'll try to get to that as we can on the email as well.
So I have the Q&A box up, and we'll just kind of both address them, maybe depending on what the questions are. The first one is that I've heard that some post-secondary institutions have a list of accommodations for each type of disability, and that's why certain accommodations are denied to certain students. And can institutions take this approach? So I think Alicia and I would both say that that would not be the correct approach to take. Definitely, students are supposed to be, accommodations are determined on a case-by-case basis, which means when we talked about the documentation and the student submitting information in their own words about that disability and that interactive process. So that is really supposed to be looking at for each student what's appropriate. Now, some schools may kind of start with some ideas of what kind of accommodations typically work for certain disabilities and kind of go from there, but it doesn't mean that they can't consider other accommodations. What may happen sometimes is that, so I'll give this example that might be helpful. So if a student comes in and says they have some history from high school that they had a calculator for their classes, but the only information that they've provided is that they have a reading disorder. So when you get to college, if all we have is a reading disorder and they were able to use a calculator and there's no other information really connecting why they were allowed to use a calculator, then we would probably deny that accommodation and say, can you please give us some more information that supports why a calculator is what you need. That information may exist, but if it's not provided to the university, then we're having trouble making that connection. So that could look like we're saying we won't ever give a calculator if you have a reading disorder, but it's because the information isn't really supporting it. So it's a little easier with some accommodations. So if you ask for extra time and you have a reading disorder, that makes sense. I mean, that's probably going to be appropriate almost all the time. So it could look like you're saying we only provide certain accommodations for certain disabilities, but it's really that the information that's provided isn't really supporting the accommodation. But if a university is hard and fast, you have ADHD, we give you extra time in a reduced distraction environment, and that's it, that would not be the correct approach to take.
And there has to be an accommodation appeal process at every college. So I would say that those students need to follow that process, and worst case scenario, they could always file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights.
Okay, so next question was back to if the student is not getting the accommodations that they need. So just a little bit more information. So the student is not consistently getting accommodations. So they have a note taker as an accommodation and extra time, and they're not getting it in all their classes. So I would encourage, one is, this says that maybe, I'm not sure if the student or the parent has called the office. What I would encourage, and Alicia, I'm going to get your input on this too, is I think the student putting in writing in an email to the director of the office what the concerns are would probably be the best place to start. I will say in this time that we've had with COVID and people remote and in person, sometimes phone things have been a challenge for all of us, not just in disability offices, but academic advisors and a lot of people. Putting things in writing is always a good idea. So I would encourage the student, not the parent, the student, to put in writing what the concerns are and send it directly to the director of that office. And if you do not get a response from there, I would find out who the supervisor for that director is and send it to them. So it's always good to start with the office because kind of if we don't know that there's a problem, we might not be able to fix it. But then if you don't get a response, then going above them would probably be the best way to go. And Alicia's nodding her head. So
Exactly.
we'll go on to the next one, and I'll let Alicia start with that. What kind of academic supports besides tutoring can the Office of Disability suggest or offer or refer to?
I would say that the most common things that I refer students to other than tutoring would be things like counseling, career services, sometimes things like some of our academic departments have things in their departmental areas that can support students within their areas. On our campus, they call them hotspots. They might call them other things on other places, but where that academic department has some supportive structure at certain places on campus. So, being able to get those people connected, that way, they can get connected with their academic department in a way that I can't necessarily support them with whatever it is that they're needing. So those are the most common things that I do.
Yeah, and I would add, and again, this is one that varies a lot depending on the university, and they have a lot of different names, but A lot of places, there's either like an academic success center or a student success center or something along those lines. They probably have tutoring, but they also may have academic coaching or workshops on things like time management or study skills or taking finals or things like that. Also, especially at the four-year universities, there are some pretty large counseling centers usually, and at community college level too also, but usually a lot smaller. But in those places, sometimes they have things like workshops, information online. So with, moving everything virtual, a lot of places now have information online. So for someone who's experiencing anxiety, they may not even have to go in and see a counselor or talk to them. They can just read the information on the website, watch some videos, and get some help there, depending on kind of what level it's at. So there's a variety of different supports, kind of depending on what it is that the student needs and what they're experiencing. So that's where I think going back to, they may be able to find that on their own, or you could refer them back to the Disability Services office to say, here's the challenges I'm having, and then that office can help them figure out what the appropriate places are to refer them to. Okay, next question. What are your thoughts on a disability service office only making recommendations of accommodations for classes in writing? So they have recommendations in writing, but the recommended accommodation is not in the accommodation plan or letter. So they have a hard time prevailing on a disability discrimination complaint because the accommodation was not actually approved. I think we're both maybe a little bit confused about that one. So not having seen recommendations that aren't officially approved, I think that is probably a challenge. And the student needs to have officially approved accommodations in writing. I don't know, Alicia, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all probably at some point in time said, well, I don't think that that's an accommodation necessarily, but you could work with your professor to see if they'll do that for you. I mean, I think we've all probably had those kinds of conversations before, whether that's verbally or in writing. So, I mean, I can see that happening where a student thinks that that's an accommodation, but really it was just a recommendation to contact your professor and see if they can do something for you. But yeah, I mean, to me, if it's not on the letter, it's not an accommodation. So
right. So I think that the student really would need to, if it's an accommodation, a formally approved accommodation, the student needs to make sure that it is in the accommodation letter. And if for some reason they're recommending something they won't put in the accommodation letter, the student may need to really clarify, is this an accommodation? Or are you just saying, hey, this might be helpful to you, which would be a little bit different. Okay, and then we have a couple of questions about Braille and tactile graphics. So those are accommodations that definitely could be provided. I don't know, Alicia, if you want to share anything.
I mean, again, I'll definitely suggest that, again, that if you use Braille as your go-to, you probably need to start helping those students transition over to some type of electronic format. That being said, like I mentioned before, there are times when Braille is very, very helpful, like tactile graphics. It can be really helpful in maybe a statistics class or a math class, or something where you're having to look at graphs and charts and things like that. Being able to see those things that are very visual in nature, being able to actually tactilely feel those kinds of things. So I'm not saying that Braille doesn't have a place and doesn't have a time and doesn't have a function. I'm just saying it can be very difficult to function in a fully Braille immersed world in a college setting or in the workplace, even, just to be perfectly honest. I mean, my father, just so y'all know, my father is completely blind, and if he functioned in a Braille world and wasn't electronically savvy, it would be very difficult for him to do what he does every day. And so, I mean, I think moving forward, students really have to become proficient in using the appropriate assistive technology. Again, not saying they're not going to use Braille, because I definitely think it has a place and a time and a function, but just knowing when it's appropriate and when it's not.
Yeah, and I would say another piece to that would be, this would be exactly when you would need to make sure that they're connecting early with the disability office. So some places, so a large university like ours, we have the capacity to do some Braille in-house, and we do have the capacity to do some tactile graphics, but that's pretty rare because the equipment that's needed to do those things is very pricey. And if there's a university or college that has not had to do that for many years, they probably haven't purchased that technology. So they're going to have to outsource that. So that just has, there's a lead time there. So it's not that it can't be done. If the student needs that and that's what they're going to need for access, definitely that's the university's responsibility. But it just may take longer in order to get it done. And especially when it comes to tactile graphics, it's almost more of an art than a science. So you have to kind of figure out what's going to work for the student. So those conversations really need to happen early on when the students know what their classes are, and that really those conversations need to happen over the summer so that they aren't behind because of the time it takes to be able to convert material. So question about if they had an accommodation in high school to get notes from the teacher, would it be sufficient to request and receive an accommodation for a note taker in college? So I think this goes back to the documentation, the request, the student report. Definitely note takers in college are a thing, and that is an option, as well as technology that can help with note taking. But depending on the campus, they may need to have some sort of documentation versus sometimes you may get a 504 plan that just has a list of accommodations that doesn't really tell what the student's disability is or what those scores are that kind of help us figure out where the strengths and weaknesses are. It may be that they actually need to get, usually people are going to want the testing report that showed how the student was diagnosed. So whether that's from the school or if it was done privately or whatever, typically for that kind of request, we would want to get that information, but that is something that can be done. It's done differently on different campuses, but note taking is an option. So question about non-class accommodations, such as face masks and support person in meetings. So the face mask is not something within the university's control. So that is something that, we can't require masks, and that's not something really that we have any control over. Support person in meetings, I think I would have to get a little bit more information about that, but typically, most campuses, if a student needs or wants someone to be in a meeting with them, that can happen. So if it's just a meeting in an office, that could be different if you're talking about something different, like a conduct issue or something like that. There may need to be an accommodation made if there's something different than their typical process. But in general, I don't think that most schools will allow someone to be in a meeting with a student. But those are things that definitely you could ask the office if you have questions. So whatever campus it is that you're going to, it would be asking them those questions to find out what are the rules, what are the policies, and do you need any kind of accommodation to those? Anything else to add on that, Alicia?
Yeah, no, I wasn't sure what the support person was, if it was like a personal care attendant or whatever, because that's not necessarily an accommodation per se, but we typically do have that in our accommodation letter to notify like the professor or whatever that there will be a personal care attendant in class with that student or whatever.
Yeah, great. And is there an assistive technology for a student with handwriting difficulties? So I would say in general, students use computers. So most college assignments are not being done handwritten. If they are, then we could look at technology to be able to meet those needs. But typically, if a student was having issues with handwriting, we would approve using a computer for their exams or their essays or whatever instead of, so if they can type, if there's a different issue there, it might be different. But if it's just actual handwriting, I would say we typically would do a computer instead of the handwriting. That, Alicia, for y'all too, that's what you would probably do, yeah.
Yep.
Okay, and then if the recommendation, so going back to the question about a recommendation versus an accommodation, if the recommendation is that the student get double time, but the student is told to tell the professors and the student has proof of their disabilities, I would just encourage the student to go through the process, and if the student is approved for double time, that should be on their letter. If the student is only approved for time and a half, but they've been told to ask for double time, then I would tell the student that they need to file an appeal to that accommodation, or ask to speak to the director, or do something. If they're being told two different things, then they need to get that cleared up. And the formal accommodation should read what it is that it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and I mean, again, if they were told no, they can't have double time and that they should just ask their professors, then they've actually been denied that accommodation request, and they should follow whatever the college's appeals process is for that accommodation denial. Every college can have their own process, so I can't tell you what that looks like, but you know, every college does have to have a process for that. So I would definitely encourage that person to follow that process at their college.
This is Randy, just real quick, just a question about the appeals process. Do you, can you maybe explain what that might look like at your schools, just so people understand? And is there a time limit where decisions have to be made? I'm just curious, because for these students, a lot of this, I mean, to appeal like time and a half compared to double time, if it takes too long, then it could affect their grades. And so how does, in general, how does that work?
Yeah, Alicia, you want to go first?
Sure. So on our campus, once an accommodation is denied, you only have a few weeks to actually submit an appeal. There's a form that you fill out where you explain what your request was, what the response was from your disability services office, and that appeal actually comes to me because I'm not involved in the making of accommodation decisions here at my college. That's made at the campus level, and I work in what's called our system office. And so those appeals come to me, and I would review the documentation, the student's appeal, you know, note letter. I would actually talk to the student through either virtual meeting, phone, in-person meeting, whatever the case would be. If I have questions, I would get clarification. I would discuss it with the disability services provider or campus that made that decision. And then we would go through the process of determining if their request was appropriate or if the college made the right decision in denying that accommodation. And so that's what our process looks like. But you do have a limited amount of time to submit that appeal. So you can't come back a semester later and say, I want to appeal this decision. It has to be done within a few weeks of that decision being made.
Yeah, and so I would say on our campus, it's slightly different. We don't have a timeline, but nothing will change with the accommodations until the appeal is made. Similarly to Alicia, I'm typically not involved in the original decisions about accommodations, and so appeals do go to me as the director, and I'm the final appeal. So students, I will meet with the student and talk to them about their reasoning for their request. I'll review the documentation. I'll review why the accommodation was denied. And then invite the student to provide any additional information that they might have, like anything that they think that maybe they didn't tell us originally, but would be helpful in that decision. We'll take that into consideration and then make a decision from there. So that's in general. So that happens. Okay. If a student still feels like maybe they feel like they're being discriminated against because we denied their appeal, they can file a civil rights complaint where they say that our office actually discriminated against them. And that would be like any other civil rights complaint on our campus. And there's a process for doing that. That would look different on every campus, but students should be able to appeal within their campus if they feel like they were discriminated against, whether it's from a faculty member or from the disability office or from parking or from anyone. They should be able to file a complaint. And then if they want to go outside of campus, then they can file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, and that is also perfectly acceptable. And we try to make sure that students know that those are all their options. So we're not trying to hide from them that they have the ability to file those complaints.
Well, ladies, thank you both very much. We are out of time. It was an excellent session. We already got several comments from people that had to jump off early for other meetings that they really enjoyed the presentation. So we will get the materials posted to our website and the link to the YouTube recording we post to our YouTube channel. I'd like to thank the sign language interpreters, the Spanish interpreters, as well as our real-time captioning provider. And to the rest of you, have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.